Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our latest Facebook Live Ranger Talk. We're going to go ahead and give some folks some more time to actually log in and check it out. So just bear with me for just a few moments here while we wait and do that. In the meantime, I'm here in my office at work. I've got the place to myself, which is kind of nice. You can enjoy the posters behind me, the Heroes of the Great Outdoors. Got another poster about the 2016 Centennial Celebration directly behind me, my hat, of course. And then also a little poster here to my right about our introductory film. So enjoy that, and we'll get started here in just a minute. All right, well, thank you once again for tuning in to our site's latest Facebook Live Ranger Talk. My name is Ben Anderson, one of the Rangers here at the Maggie Walker National Historic Site. I'm glad to have you with me today. What I'm going to do today is talk to you not so much about Maggie Walker, the famous bank president, or even Maggie Walker, the fraternal leader, the successful fraternal leader. These are the stories we tell so often, we love to tell them. But instead, we're going to be looking at Maggie Walker, the activist. To do it, we're going to be exploring 6 different examples over a 51-year period during her life, where Walker takes on the role of an activist in a variety of ways, primarily to combat racial segregation and discrimination. And not only is this, I think, a really relevant topic now, given the prevalence of activism that we, of course, are seeing these days, but because these stories really combine to form a lesser known and very important part of Maggie Walker's life, my hope is that by the end of the talk, you'll not only have developed a deeper appreciation for who Maggie Walker was, but also a clearer sense for what connects the activism from her time to the activism that we have seen ever since. Now, last thing before we dive right in, I'm going to be the only one on camera today, but I'm not truly doing this talk alone. One of my colleagues, Ranger Mike, is going to be hanging out in the comments section. So throughout the talk, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share with us, please do so. Mike is going to be attempting to address those as best he can. And after the talk, I'm going to jump in there as well and try to help out as well as I can with that. I'm also going to be prompting Mike to post a couple of things that supplement the talk throughout. And of course, you'll know when that happens, because I'll mention that to him during the talk. But if nothing else, thank you, Mike, for helping out. Well, to dive right in, let's head to our first example, which is going to take us all the way back to the spring of 1883. Maggie Walker is Maggie Mitchell at this point. She's 18 years old, and she's about to graduate from a place called the Richmond Colored Normal School. She's about to graduate high school. And I wanted to show you an image, first of all, of the school itself. This is from the Valentine Museum's collection, showing you the school in the early 1900s, where it was during her time, right at the intersection of Lee and 12th Streets. It's unfortunately no longer with us today. But Walker is about to, or I should say Mitchell, is about to graduate from that school in the spring of 1883, but there is a catch, and that is that her fellow students are threatening to wage a boycott of the graduation ceremony unless they're allowed to graduate at the same place and under the same conditions as white high school students in Richmond. And for them, that means graduating at a place called the Richmond Theater and having that theater all to themselves. Now, it's worth, I think, stepping back and putting this moment in perspective, because first of all, to get a high school degree in 1883 was itself a very, very big deal. We know the Richmond Colored Normal School, for instance, was the only high school that African Americans could attend in Richmond at the time. This is a period when there were about 30,000 African Americans living in Richmond as well. And the graduating class in 1883 consisted of only 10 students, which, as it turns out, was a pretty average sized graduating class for the school. And so this is an accomplishment so rare that it had the effect, really, of catapulting folks into the elite of society. And I would argue that few people probably understood that better, or really understood the significance of that better than the students themselves, because once again, this is 1883. Slavery and the Civil War have ended just less than 20 years earlier. Right? The students themselves are the sons and daughters of the formerly enslaved, and so it is a safe bet. They understand, right, just how much this accomplishment is going to mean, not just in the eyes of their parents, who never had access to this kind of formal education before, but also to themselves and their families moving forward. Now, unfortunately, we don't have really any hard evidence telling us exactly how Maggie Walker gets involved in the boycott, but thankfully one of her classmates, named Wendell P Dabney, will go on to write an autobiography and include a little section on the boycott itself. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. It's rather lengthy. It is worth a read. Dabney was a really, really gifted writer. He, in fact, will write Maggie Walker's first biography in 1927, which is also worth a read. But I will have Ranger Mike post the section Dabney wrote about the boycott in the comments section, so you can read it on your own, refer back to it as a reference. But what he ends up doing in his book is painting this very riveting scene of the moment when the 10 students are called into the principal's office and are told that the administration is aware of what the students are threatening to do, but are being told that unless they graduate at a local church, which is what the school was arranging for them to do, then they will simply not graduate. And Dabney admits this makes him and the rest of the students, of course, very nervous, but yet in that moment, he summons the courage to stand up and make this very eloquent and impassioned plea in the students' defense, the climax to which is a quote that you may be familiar with. We actually included it in our introductory film, where he says, "Our parents pay taxes just the same as you white folks, and you've got no business spending big money out of those taxes to pay for the theater for white children unless you do the same for black children." Now, Dabney's efforts are initially rewarded. The students are ultimately granted access to the Richmond Theater, but there was a catch there as well. They were to share it with white high school students in Richmond, and furthermore, it was to be a segregated affair. White students and their families were going to be on the lower level of the theater, while black students and their families would be in the upper level. And because this cut against so fundamentally what the students wanted in the first place, these turned out to be circumstances that they of course did not want to agree to. And so at the end of the day, there was a compromise reached. The students will not graduate at the theater and won't even graduate at the church that the school had arranged, but instead back at the school itself. So everyone in the end does graduate, including Maggie Mitchell, and I did want to show you an image of her degree. This is one of my favorite pieces in our collection, and of course even includes an image of the school, as you can see there, right in the middle. And so everyone gets their degree, and life moves on. But one of the ways that Dabney describes this moment in his book is really important. He says that this was the earliest example of a student strike waged by black, or a school strike rather, waged by black students in America. And of course that helps us think about this moment not just in the context of student strikes, which we've seen a lot of since that period, but also this broader context of student-led protests, which, as many know, go on to not only be a hallmark of the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, but of course continuing to unfold to this very day. Now, as far as Maggie Walker is concerned very specifically, again, we don't have that very hard evidence telling us exactly how she's involved in this 1883 boycott. But because we know that this is far from the last time that she'll take on a role as an activist, or at least be involved in a moment like this, it's always been tempting for us here at the site to really see this moment as the birth of her activism. And moving on to our second example, this is going to be a role that she will more forcefully embrace for example, number 2. For that, we are going to now fast forward a total of 21 years to the spring of 1904. And in this moment, we are going to see Maggie Walker teaming up with several other black leaders here in Richmond to launch a boycott, protesting racial segregation on Richmond's streetcars. And I think one way to really understand the shift that takes place in terms of Maggie Walker going from maybe involved in the student boycott, maybe not, to of course more forcefully taking on a leadership role here in 1904, it helps to understand, first of all, that a lot had changed in her life during those past 20 years, and particularly in the previous 5. In 1899, for instance, she gets elected head of the Independent Order of St. Luke. She opens her newspaper, the St. Luke Herald, in 1902, and then most famously will open her bank in 1903, the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, that fall. So by the time we get to the spring of 1904, she is a prominent national figure with a bank and a newspaper at her disposal. So some 2 pretty powerful weapons for it to use in a moment like this, and she is not, as it turns out, afraid to use them. Early reports in the boycott itself showed, for instance, that Walker and the other black bank presidents in Richmond were getting together and exploring the idea of forming a black-owned transportation company that would serve as an alternative to the protesters choosing not to ride the streetcars. Now, nothing seems to have materialized from that, and I don't exactly know why that's the case. But perhaps more importantly, we also see Maggie Walker using the pages of her newspaper, the St. Luke Herald, to organize and motivate the protests. And of course, I can't bring that up without reading an example. This is my favorite. It comes from a 1904 issue of the St. Luke Herald, in which she states, "Distances are no greater in these days than in the days when there were no trolley cars. Burdens are no heavier now than they were before trolley cars were invented. Storms and sunshine affect us no differently from what they did before the advent of trolley cars. Then why the surrender of principle? From one end of the country to the other, the eyes of the nation are upon the action of the colored people of Richmond." Wow. And it is perhaps thanks to strong words like that that the boycott will last not just 1 year, but a total of 2 years, eventually wrapping up in the summer of 1906. Now, sadly, when it ends, it's not because the company running Richmond streetcars had decided to stop enforcing racial segregation, but instead because the state of Virginia had recently passed a law mandating racial segregation on the streetcars. And from a protester standpoint, you can begin to imagine how this would come across as a major blow, right? You have spent the last 2 years hoping to convince a company to not enforce a rule that they were choosing to follow. But once the state comes along and mandates it, of course, that changes the game entirely and makes this a much, much more difficult fight. When we step back and we look at this 1904 to 1906 streetcar boycott here in Richmond, one of the many things that stands out about it to me, in addition to how long it was waged, how well organized an effort it was on behalf of the black community, but also because of the fact that it was far from alone. As it turns out, during the first decade of the 1900s, there were over 20 protests over segregation on streetcars throughout the South. And in case you are like a lot of visitors that we see here on site, who are expressed some sort of shock or surprise at this, because perhaps the first instance of something like this going on happens down in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Well, there is a much longer history to this than you might well have known. And in case you're interested to learn more about it, I would encourage you to track down this book. This is, of course, just an image of the cover, but it's called Right to Ride. It came out back in 2010 by Professor Blair Kelly. And one of the things that Kelly explains in the book was that these protests didn't come out of nowhere, that they were instead a reaction to this growing presence of legalized racial segregation throughout the South that itself was stemming from a very recent Supreme Court decision in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson back in 1896. And in that decision, the Supreme Court will decide that yes, racial segregation is constitutional, but only if it's done under separate but equal conditions. And because the Plessy case was specifically about where a black man could sit on a train in Louisiana, some of the earliest adaptations to this decision by governments in the South was to begin applying legalized racial segregation in the world of transportation. So we'll see some of the earliest segregation laws affecting trains and passenger boats and streetcars themselves. But any student of the 20th century knows, however, the laws will not stop there, but can instead continue to spread over the next several decades, eventually really coming to affect just about every aspect of day-to-day life, including where you could live. And that, by design, is a good segue to example number 3, which is now going to take us into the summer of 1911. In fact, July 23rd of 1911 to be exact. Maggie Walker at this moment has just written a letter to Richmond City Council asking permission to rent a building called the City Auditorium for use to host her upcoming Independent Order of St. Luke Convention. And if you want to take a second to show you once again an image of the building itself, this is from the 1930s. From a local newspaper called the Richmond Times-Dispatch, but I don't believe much had changed at this point from from the 19 teens. This is also a building still with us today. Those of you tuning in who are familiar with Richmond might recognize it as Virginia Commonwealth University's Carey Street Gym. So it is possible to drive by it and still see this building standing, very recognizable still, as you could guess. And when Maggie Walker writes this letter, whether or not she anticipated it sparking any sort of controversy at all is a little unclear, but what it will do is really lead to a quick but very forceful debate, at least on the city government level, about how to interpret and enforce a very new law called a segregation ordinance. And this is a law that stated that from this point forward, you couldn't just move to any part of the city that you wanted unless the majority of the people living in your immediate vicinity were of the same race as you. So, in other words, this was an attempt to put a halt to any further racial integration going on in Richmond's neighborhoods. And I say this was a new law to Richmond because it was. Richmond's segregation ordinance had only passed 3 months earlier in April of 1911. But this was also a new law as far as the entire country was concerned. Richmond's segregation ordinance, as it turns out, was only the second segregation ordinance to pass in the United States. The dubious honor of coming in first there was the city of Baltimore, which had passed their segregation ordinance in December of 1910. And what we will see from this point forward is that after passing in Baltimore and in Richmond, these segregation ordinances will continue to creep further to the south and to the west. By the mid-19 teens, they're in at least 12 cities and towns in the United States. And the reason this connects with Maggie Walker is because just a few days after writing that letter requesting permission to rent the city auditorium, she receives a response from the city's building inspector, who informs her that because she's black and the Independent Order of St. Luke is a black organization, for them to occupy the city auditorium, which was in a majority white section of the city of Richmond, would be a violation, in his view, of the city's segregation ordinance. And so, no, she may not rent it. Now, we don't have Maggie Walker's response to that, if there was one, on record. We don't know what she says back, if anything, to the city's building inspector. But what is well documented, thankfully, is that soon after the building inspector's decision is made public, the city's attorney, the city attorney for Richmond, will come out publicly and challenge that interpretation of the segregation ordinance, hinging his case on the fact that the city auditorium was a public building. It was maintained by taxpayer funds, and therefore Maggie Walker has just as much a right to rent it as anybody else in the city. Backing up the city attorney, as it turns out, was the city's main white newspaper, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which will publish an article in support of the city attorney's conclusion, and also stating that not only is this sound legal reasoning, but we should not forget, this is Maggie Walker, this is the Independent Order of St. Luke. They are good people doing good things in the Times-Dispatch's article, as they claim, and we don't want to do anything to upset them. And so, thankfully, it is this law, or is this interpretation of the ordinance that will win the day. Soon after that counter argument is made, the building inspector's decision is reversed. The Independent Order of St. Luke will go on to host their annual convention at the city auditorium, and by all accounts, it was a major success. Reporting said this was the largest convention that the Independent Order of St. Luke had ever hosted up to this point. A full 800 delegates from around the country took part. So in the short term of this story, this is of course a major win for Maggie Walker. And in case you're wondering at this point, why I've included it in this story, because lo and behold, Maggie Walker hasn't really taken on the role of an activist, at least consciously yet. What I think qualifies this story for the inclusion in this talk today is because when you look back at how this debate plays out, not only did the city attorney come out very quickly and very publicly to rebuke the building inspector's argument, but then when you also look at the Times-Dispatch's support of the governor and really adding to that yes, this is Maggie Walker. We don't want to do anything to harm her, the Independent Order of St. Luke. What I would argue is going on here is not so much Maggie Walker physically taking on the role of an activist, but rather her reputation and her stature being big enough and large enough and powerful enough to really take on that role in and of themselves. Now, ultimately, this is, as I said, a short-term victory for Maggie Walker. As you may have noticed, of course, though, this does not do anything to challenge segregation ordinances themselves. That fight will have to wait another 6 years for a Supreme Court decision in 1917, a case called Worley versus Buchanan, in which case the Supreme Court actually strikes down segregation ordinances as unconstitutional, citing that they were an infringement on the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. They were an infringement on, as the court says, an individual's right to property. Now, critics of the Worley decision will point out that yes, they strike down the segregation ordinances, and that's a good thing, but they didn't go far enough. Right? They didn't try to challenge racial segregation in and of itself. They didn't try to challenge the separate but equal doctrine laid out in that Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896. And so as a result, that legal challenge will have to wait another 37 years for the more famous Brown versus Board of Education case of 1954. So critics of Worley versus Buchanan will say it had an opportunity in 1917 to be that Brown versus Board of Education moment, and it missed it. But what also legal scholars will say is that the lawyers arguing the case in Brown will routinely cite the Worley decision as one in support of their case, and ultimately it's one that makes the Brown versus Board of Education decision an easier one to make. So it may not have gone as far as folks may have liked, but it does appear to have at least helped make the Brown case more of a success, more likely a success. So it did contribute in that way. Now, we're going to switch gears now to our fourth example and not be talking here so much about racial segregation as gender discrimination and how that intersects with voting rights. And so, predictably, this will take us now to the year 1920. It is, in fact, August 26th now in 1920. U.S. Congress has just passed the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, so a big, momentous day. But it's also done this just a little over 2 months before the country's next presidential election. So if you happen to be a woman living in most states in this country, like Virginia, that had not allowed women to vote up till this point, there's about to be a major rush to get as many women registered to vote as possible in advance of that election. And so you can begin to imagine the logistical problem that will result from that. But if you're a black woman, as it turns out, there was an additional problem, one that had existed long before the 19th Amendment had been passed, and one that will actually continue to exist long after it passes. And through Maggie Walker's story, I think we can get a better sense of what that is. We know that on August 26th of 1920, Maggie Walker wasn't in town. She was actually out of town on a bit of a vacation. There was some business and pleasure mixed together. She will come back to Virginia and Richmond on the night of September 10th. We know that thanks to her 1920 diary, which also shows that 2 days later on September 12th, she successfully registers herself to vote. So on one hand, we see a very quick turnaround on her part, perhaps a personal response to this shortened timeline of voting registration, who knows. But what her diary of 1920 also reveals to us is that over the course of the next week, there are going to be 3 meetings held by black leaders here in Richmond to discuss what this effort to get black women registered to vote is going to look like. In fact, Maggie Walker hosts one of those meetings at her office building, St. Luke Hall. And while we don't know everything that's discussed and concluded at those meetings, what appears very clear is that Walker emerges from them a leader in this new effort, because on September 20th of 1920, when Richmond City Hall opens its doors for the first time, invites hundreds of women to come down to City Hall and register all at once in Richmond. Maggie Walker is not just there that day, she's there on the 21st and goes back again on the 23rd. And she's there not only to coach black women, prepare them for the registration process, but also to keep an eye on the registrars themselves and the process itself. And the reason she needs to do this, it turns out, is because, at least in Virginia, for the past 18 years, there have been some major restrictions on voting in the state that had proved nearly 100% effective at keeping eligible black male voters from the polls. Back in 1902, when the state passed its new state constitution, it instituted a poll tax, a literacy test, property requirements, all as part of the voter registration process. And some have argued that in the years since, that kept as many as 90% of eligible black men away from the voting booth. And so if you're Maggie Walker here in 1920, you may be saying to yourself, the 19th Amendment is a step forward for women generally, it's a step forward for the United States, but it is doing nothing to make access to the vote as fair and equal as it needs to be. And so when Maggie Walker shows up to City Hall those 3 days in September, you can imagine it's with her fair share of skepticism about how fairly this process is going to play out for black women. And thankfully, in that case, we actually have the reporting to prove it. I want to read to you a section, a little bit long, but worth an entire read. This comes from the September 21st, 1920 issue of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, reporting on what had happened at City Hall the day before. One thing that this article had already noted before the section that I'm about to read is that the registration process was actually segregated by race. As women showed up to City Hall, black women were directed to the basement to register, while white women were directed to the fourth floor. But here's what it has to say about Maggie Walker. It says, Maggie L. Walker, president of the St. Luke Savings Bank, one of the most prominent Negro women in Virginia, was a conspicuous figure along the dark line in the basement. Early in the day, she attracted attention by declaring partiality was being shown to white women. Finally, she carried her complaint to Judge Richardson, asking the judge to appoint Negro assistants to Registrar Woodson. Judge Richardson referred her to the registrar. Instead, she sought out the secretary of the Electoral Board, who listened to her complaint, then informed her that only the registrar had authority to designate his assistants. When Registrar Woodson was closing the doors against the crowd of women upstairs and down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, an hour later than the usual closing hour, Maggie Walker protested vigorously. She said 100 or more were waiting in the basement to be registered. This is our closing time, replied the registrar. They can come tomorrow or some other day, or they can wait until October 2nd when there will be 31 registrars to enroll them, they say. Secretary Ingram had previously given the same information regarding the general registration day, to which the registrar alluded, but Maggie Walker exhorted the colored women to, quote, come again tomorrow, and reiterated the tender of her own services as a deputy registrar. She insisted that colored women be employed as well as whites. So it's stories like that ought to keep in mind, right, as we spend the remainder of 2020 observing the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which we ought to be doing, but also to keep in mind that, yes, while the 19th Amendment did open the door to voting much wider than it had been, it's going to take nearly a half a century before these obstacles to voting that were, of course, affecting African Americans more than any others to be fully addressed. It's going to take the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to finally do away with these poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. So let's not forget that for all the good the 19th Amendment did, it was not enough as far as, especially as far as making the vote and access to it equal as it deserved to be. Now we're going to switch to our fifth example, and for this we don't have to switch gears too terribly much. It's only going to take us forward 1 year, and it's also still going to be within the same theme, really, as far as voting and elections. And here we're going to see in 1921 Maggie Walker not only having led the charge with voting registration, but also now leading by example in terms of political representation. 1921 we'll see Virginia's first gubernatorial election since the passage of the 19th Amendment. And Maggie Walker, it should be pointed out, will show up as a candidate on a gubernatorial ticket, an all-black gubernatorial ticket that was known as the Lily Black ticket, part of the Republican Party. I do want to show you an image of the ballot itself in case you've never seen this before. Of course, it shows you the head of the ticket is a man named John Mitchell Jr. You can see there at the top. Down here, roughly where my finger is, maybe, you can see Maggie Walker. She's the candidate for an office called the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And in case that is not something that sounds too familiar, this is a position that would have had her in charge of the entire public school system in the state. But that is no longer an elected office. That is now a political appointed office. And so that's why you may not, of course, don't see it on ballots these days. But it was on the ballot in 1921. And as I mentioned, as you may have seen there on the ballot, the Lily Black ticket was affiliated with the Republican Party. African Americans had traditionally been supporters of the Republican Party up till this point, but the presence of the Lily Black ticket, of course, shows just how deeply divided politics within the Republican Party had become, especially in terms of race. This was not a problem that the Democratic Party was dealing with at the time. And so, as you might predict, going into that election, we've got a deeply divided one party, or the Republicans on one hand, and a fairly unified Democratic Party. So, as you can predict, it's the Democratic Party that is going to win out. Well, a couple of things are worth pointing out here. Because this was the first gubernatorial election since the 19th Amendment had passed, Maggie Walker takes advantage, as early as anyone possibly could have, to run for office, and becomes, in effect, the first black woman to run for a statewide office in Virginia. So a little bit of historical significance about that. But two things I think have been really significant about that ever since. When you look at statewide elections in Virginia since that time, while women have since been elected to statewide office in Virginia, and black men have been elected to office, statewide office in Virginia, Virginia has yet to elect a black woman to statewide office. And so Maggie Walker, of course, here in 1921, attempting to do something that still has not been done. And what's even more interesting about this is that we're coming up on 2021 on the state's next gubernatorial election, exactly 100 years since the moment we're talking about now. And of course, it's very, very early. A lot can change. But one of the most interesting developments in this race is that two black women have recently announced their candidacy for governor. And regardless of your political leanings and affiliations, I would encourage you to keep your eyes on this race, because in the event that one of them is to win, it will not only become the first black female governor of Virginia, but really the first black woman to become elected to statewide office since Maggie Walker had tried in 1921. So this is one of those historical narratives that is far, far from over. So keep your eyes on that one. Well, it's finally time to switch gears to our final example that we're going to be talking about today. This is one that addresses the issue of economic inequality, and it's going to take us into the period of the Great Depression, and specifically into the spring of 1934. Now, this turns out to be Maggie Walker's final year. She'll pass away at the age of 70 on December 15th of 1934. But in this particular moment, she is 69 years old. She is paralyzed from the waist down. She's been having to use a wheelchair to get around for the past 6 years. It is believed that that's caused by diabetes, or that was caused by diabetes. But she doesn't let that stop her from participating in a very new wave of protests that were gripping American cities, a campaign known as Don't Buy Where You Can't Work. And the goal of the campaign was very simple. It aimed to put pressure on successful white-owned businesses in black neighborhoods to hire black workers and undo some of the financial strain that had recently been brought on by the Great Depression, which at this point is only about 4 years old. And these protests often took the form of pickets outside of these specific businesses themselves. And when we step back and look at it, one of the things that's really interesting about this particular campaign, especially in the context of this talk today, is that we see yet another interesting Baltimore to Richmond connection. Of course, back in 1911, when we were talking about the Segregation Ordinance, that took the form of a segregation law trickling south to Richmond from Baltimore. In this case, it's kind of the flip side, because we're now seeing a form of protest trickle south from Baltimore to Richmond. And what's especially important to note about that is that the way in which these protests unfolded in Baltimore appears to have had a great impact on what will happen in Richmond. The protests that begin in Baltimore under the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign actually get started in late 1933, more or less as a series of grassroots efforts. They will become more and more organized as time goes on. The NAACP, for instance, will gradually take more and more of a leadership role in them. But their first major success comes in early 1934 when they convince a major food store chain called the A&P to hire more than 3 dozen black workers in Baltimore's northwest section. And what's interesting to point out about that is that by the time these protests arrive in Richmond in the spring of 1934, not only is the NAACP taking the reins right from day one, but their first target in Richmond was the A&P chain as well, which actually had over 60 branches throughout the city. And again, when we look at the details here, it makes every bit of sense that Maggie Walker would be involved in this protest, because not only had she been deeply involved with the NAACP for many years, she'd actually sat on the national board of directors for the past 10 years, for instance. She'd also used her fraternal order, her bank, and other businesses to bring employment and economic empowerment to the black community of Richmond for decades. And to top it all off, there was a branch of the A&P food store chain right across the street from her bank at the corner of First and Marshall here in Jackson Ward. So yes, she's 69, yes, she's in a wheelchair, but with this context in mind, it would seem almost a little bit strange had she not have gotten involved. And thankfully, in this case, we have just a little bit of newspaper reporting to really tell us or give us a little bit of insight in terms of how specifically Maggie Walker was involved. I want to read you just one sentence, but it's a loaded sentence, from the April 7th, 1934 issue of a newspaper called the New Journal and Guide. This was a black newspaper based in Norfolk, Virginia. And this is reporting on these protests here in Richmond. And here's what it says about Maggie Walker. It says, Mrs. Maggie L. Walker, right worthy Grand Secretary of the Independent Order of St. Luke, and the first woman in America to serve as president of a bank, it is reported, unable to picket, sat for a while on the corner with the picket sign perched on her Packard car. And if that doesn't paint a picture of someone who is unwilling to step down or back down from a fight, I don't know what does. Now, unfortunately, the record is a bit unclear in terms of what comes of these protests in Richmond. It's not at all as clear whether they'll be as successful as the ones in Baltimore or not. I personally have yet to find anything that gives some hard data on that. But what we do see is that the protests do continue into the summer. The last I have seen of them, there was a parade in the city of Richmond in June of 1934 to heighten the awareness of the campaign itself. And Maggie Walker was one of three slated to give a speech at the culmination of that parade. So we see her continue to be involved for the next several months. Ultimately, this is, of course, just 6 months before she passes away. But when we step back and we assess the legacy of the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign, one of the interesting things that I've always felt about it was that it won't even be decided whether what these protesters were doing was legal until another 4 years after Maggie Walker passes away. It'll take a challenge to these protesters by a grocery store chain in Washington, D.C. to create a legal case that will eventually make its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, which decides in 1938 that yes, indeed, this form of consumer boycott picketing was a legal form of protest. And as a result, not only are we going to continue to see Don't Buy Where You Can't Work protests continue for the next several decades all across the country, being organized by multiple groups. To show you an example of that, for instance, I'm going to show you an image that I took off of the Organization of American Historians website that shows an image of a Don't Buy Where You Can't Work protest going on in California in the 1960s, organized by a prominent civil rights organization called CORE, which was the Congress of Racial Equality. And so not only will we see a continuation of those protests for a much longer time, what this also decides is this also becomes a legal case that helps to lay the foundation, the legal foundation on which much of the modern civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s will be waged. For instance, when you think about the sit-in movement of the 1960s, that was a chapter of the civil rights movement that was certainly not without its struggles and contentions and even violence. But one of the issues that could never be seriously contended was whether or not what the protesters were doing was legal, because lo and behold, that was a fight that had been settled back in the 1930s. Well, I want to thank you again for tuning in today. I want to finish not with my own words, you've heard plenty of those today, but instead with the words of Maggie Walker herself. This is a piece that she wrote back in 1914 called The Power of Agitation. It first appeared in the St. Luke Herald, eventually gets picked up and printed in multiple black newspapers in the months that followed. And I think it's a perfect way to wrap this talk up and to really emphasize just how important the protesting and activism were to her. She says this: "The greatest power on earth for the righting of wrongs is the power of agitation. When the spirit and power of agitation die among a people, they are doomed beyond all hope of resuscitation and redemption. So important is the power that it is guaranteed to the people through the mandates of the Constitution of the United States. It is the agitation of the waters of the sea which prevents stagnation and death. It is the agitation of the air which gives pure air to breathe. It is the agitation of the blood which gives us the power of motion and life, and it is the agitation of thoughts and ideas which prevents brain stagnation and mental death. When a people lose that interest in themselves to that extent that they stand supinely by, quietly submitting to wrong, they have reached the danger point in race progress development. Thank you again for tuning in. Hope to see you in person at the Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site real soon.